Good evening and welcome. This is the sixth lecture in a seven-lecture series at the Calvert Marine Museum on Maryland in the Age of Sail with our curator of maritime history, Mark Wilkins, who is doing the Civil War period tonight. This will be a very interesting lecture. We are recording so that we can put this on the our website afterwards. So please keep yourself muted, and if you don't want to be recorded, also turn off your video. But again, the last lecture will be in 2 weeks at 5 o'clock on Thursday, June 3rd. But without further ado, I will hand it over to Mark Wilkins, and he will take on a wonderful
journey. All right, thank you, Jeff. Well, it's a beautiful day outside today, so those of you that are joining us, that's very nice of you to do so. Let me see if I can share screen here. Yes, here we go. All right. Let's minimize this. Let's maximize that. Slideshow from the beginning. Yeah, so the Battle of Hampton Roads in the Civil War, the Chesapeake and in Maryland. A lot of stuff happened in Maryland during the Civil War. Some of it quite interesting, some of it actually kind of humorous. So we'll start by giving a general overview of the context, which, as you know, is so important with every historical event. So just a quick recap, the arc of the progression: Fort Sumter, April 12th, 1861, the kickoff for the war. Soon after the guns fell silent on Fort Sumter, Lincoln basically orders a Union naval blockade of southern ports, right? So this was cooked up by General Winfield Scott, called the Anaconda Plan. And you can see this wonderful illustration in the middle pane, basically showing the Anaconda going up the Mississippi to and circling the panhandle of Florida and up to Chesapeake Bay in DC. Basically cut off supplies and ammunition, etc., food from the South, so that basically deprive them of their ability to make war. And there's old Winnie there in the upper right-hand corner, looking just as happy as ever. Kind of a sourpuss. And you can see kind of a map on the left of the blockade in greater detail. So unfortunately, Lincoln unwittingly, they were seen as rebels, secessionists, et cetera, but he accorded them sovereignty by imposing a naval blockade, which is an act of war against a foreign country. So that was kind of a little bit of a backfire, kind of gave the South a more greater sense of itself than it might have had initially. All right. So Baltimore, that foul assassin's den. So yeah, this is first Union casualty happened in Baltimore. I mean, for whatever reason, Baltimore has this long, rich legacy of riots and all kinds of things in times of war. So yeah, Luther Ladd of the 6th Massachusetts was the first Union casualty of the war. Pennsylvania and Massachusetts troops were transiting through Baltimore on their way to DC. Angry mobs incurred the casualties. Mayor Brown pleaded for calm, sent a communique to Lincoln, basically saying that, basically all hell's breaking loose in Baltimore. Excitement is fearful. Meantime, Southern sympathizers were burning bridges around Baltimore, cutting off railway from the north. So this was an important disruption in getting transiting troops and materiel where it needed to go. And those are some illustrations of the angry mob doing their thing in Baltimore. All right. So the Naval Academy was in danger. It was, as we learned from the last couple talks ago, it was opened in 1845 on an old Fort Severn site, which was found in 1808. So USS Constitution was at the Academy as a training ship. And basically, this is like defend old Ironsides at all costs, even it meant burning her. They did not want that symbol of U.S. naval power and preeminence that occurred during the War of 1812 to fall into the hands of the rebels. Okay, so this was a great fear. And Annapolis was a more southern than Baltimore, had more southern sympathies, ironically. So 724 Massachusetts 8th Volunteers of General Butler arrived on the Maryland, workaround from being cut off from the north in Annapolis. Okay. So yeah, this was kind of another mess. The person in charge of the Gosport Naval Yard, Commodore Macaulay, really was indecisive. He didn't know what to do. He knew the rebels were approaching. He didn't want it to fall into their hands because of the huge amount of material, equipment, especially cannon, right? Ammunition, naval stores, cordage, etc. So he procrastinated to the last minute, and finally was evacuated and burned to prevent Confederate occupation. Among the Union ships burned was the USS Merrimack and the USS Pennsylvania. You can see the Pennsylvania, this upper right-hand pane, sort of hearkening back. You have to understand the Navy at this point in time was in a very pronounced period of transition from the old line of battle vessels like HMS Victory, which the Pennsylvania was a very clear nod to. These large, cumbersome, first-rate ships with 3 decks of guns and more, basically big targets at this point based on the advances in ordnance. Anyway, and of course the USS Merrimack that will become, as you know, very important later on when they converted her. So anyway, this is Merrimack in the lower left. It's a steam frigate, basically. And this was a common thing. The Navy was slow to change, but steam was on the rise, and many of these Union vessels were converted to steam or screw propulsion, in addition to the sail power that they typically had. Navy, as I said, Navy was very slow to make this transition, okay? So the burning of the Naval Gosport created quite a blaze, although the damage was superficial. The dry docks were still in good shape. Many cannon was good, wasn't spiked, large quantity of tools and equipment, and the Merrimack, which we mentioned, which could be refloated. 1,195 heavy guns went to the Confederacy, and that was the big prize for the Confederacy because, as you know, the South lacked the industrial capacity that the North had. So things like this had to be imported, naval guns, large guns, had to be imported or stolen or appropriated. And, most of the foundries were in the North that would make these types of weapons, and the South just didn't have that. So this was a huge prize for the South and a huge embarrassment for the North. Yeah, so Old Ironsides heads for Newport. Rather than endanger her in Annapolis, basically they took her up to Newport, Rhode Island, to basically keep her protected from Confederate raiders. Troops repaired bridges, and the railroad were able to reach and protect DC again. She was manned by midshipmen faithful to the Union, departed the bay under tow by the USS Cooler, and escorted by the Harriet Lane for the duration of the war. So she was safe and sound, and that was good news for the Union. Yeah, so the secession climate in Maryland, it was, Maryland never seceded, that's important, but the state was divided on its loyalties, right? You had Southern sympathizers, you had Northern sympathizers. It was, good old Maryland being ever so moderate in the middle. You always had a balance, those that wanted this, those that wanted that, and the compromise reached in the middle. But importantly, didn't secede. General Butler's contraband statement of Fort Monroe and the USS Confiscation Act was 2 important pieces of initiatives that were to pave the way for the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. These were basically very ingenious ideas, basically saying that slaves were, if they were property, as the South claimed they were not, they were not human beings, they were property. That as such is contraband and could be appropriated and taken away from them. So this was an interesting first step in the way towards equal rights and civil liberties. All right. As I mentioned, U.S. Navy in transition. This was a tough thing. I mean, it's probably one of the most interesting periods in naval history, the Civil War, because you had all of these different things coming kind of to a head at the same time. Advances in armament. You had these Dahlgren guns. Swivel guns, which is a precursor to the modern turret, right? Because the gun could swivel 360 degrees, just like a turret, and elevation could be controlled. So rather than turn the ship, we're just going to turn the gun, right? So a razzii was a common practice done to these. You have to understand, naval appropriations were slow and ponderous back then, and many ships that were designed, in the 1820s were just getting built inside the 1840s and 1850s. So these are still on the stocks, making their ways, slowly. And meantime, there were these advances in how a vessel should be armed, how it should be equipped, what was the propulsion going to be. So a lot of these were changed from their original configuration in Razee. They were cut down, okay, like the Cumberland. A lot of them started off with, say, gun ports very similar to USS Constitution, and then they realized, well, wait a minute, we don't really need as many guns. What we need are better guns and maybe fewer of them, and some on the spar deck that could pivot, like these pivot guns, these swivel guns that I was mentioning, okay? So Navy in transition, and there were factions in the Navy that were very conservative, others that were very progressive. So of course that causes tension and indecision, right? So constellation, yeah. Many think that this was the constellation of the old Ironsides USS Constitution class, but no, she was a different vessel. I mean, some debate whether that when the old Constellation was disassembled, some of her was put into the new corvette that was built in Norfolk in 1853-54. But that's a matter of debate. The records are sketchy at best. You have to know her hull shape is very different from that class of vessel. She has a rounded stern, not a flat transom. And her equipment, her armament is very different. She had two 28-inch, she had 28-inch shell guns and was supposed to have two 10-inch pivot guns on her spar deck. And they basically, you had one pivot gun forward before the foremast, basically aiming forward and all points around that mast, and then aft. So give a very commanding field of fire, right? And shell guns, well, let me just talk a little bit about shell guns. So what was important about a shell gun as opposed to a solid shot weapon is that a shell gun in naval testing had about 10 times the destructive power of a solid shot round. So what happened was you would fire a shell, it would embed itself in a white oak side of a ship and then explode. And it, like I said, at 10 times the power, blow a huge hole in the side of the ship, as opposed to just a small hole that solid shot would do. Okay, so that was a huge advance in naval gunfire and gunfire in general. So yeah, the steam frigates of the USS Merrimack in Minnesota is transitioned from all sail to embrace new technology and steam. So this also gives rise to a new class of officers and enlisted men in the Navy, and that was the engineers. Okay, and this is the rise of the engineer. This became huge with another transitional element in the Navy. Before, you didn't have these type of people on board. Now you had boilers and you had steam engines and whatnot, and these needed to be maintained to a meticulous standard, especially for combat ready status. So now you had a whole host of new types of people joining the Navy to service these engines. Okay. So the war, it was an arms race. U.S. Navy only had about 90 ships. Confederacy had none, okay? So both sides got busy. Northern shipyards worked at top speed. Of course, they could because that's what they were used to doing. But in southern shipyards, I mean, most of the shipbuilding, you have to know, is on the eastern seaboard and in the Northeast. By the time the war ended, the North had about 700 ships in service. And of course, this was to maintain and service the blockade. They needed not only large warships, but they needed vessels to service the warships, to bring food, supplies, ammunition, medical supplies, that type of thing to these vessels, and change out the ship's complement. People got tired of staying on station, and this blockade was boring, right? And of course, the Confederacy, they could not match the North in terms of the types of ships, so they had to do a workaround, okay? And we'll get to that in a little bit. So once again, I've gotten ahead of myself. So advances in armament, yeah. Henry Pegson introduced the first shell guns invented in 1823, which adopted the Navy by the 1840s. So look at that. It took almost 20 years for the Navy to get their head around this and adopt this. 10 times destructive force, as I mentioned. So Dahlgren sought to improve upon the Pegson design. He basically, let's see if that's the next slide so I don't get it. Yep, there we go. So basically the difference between his guns and the other guns was it would be a very accurate vessel with high muzzle velocity, and it could fire solid shot as well as shell shot. Okay, so this was important, and basically, some were better for others. I mean, anyway, it was a more versatile gun. He was a line officer in the Navy, and he had patented his gun. So it was kind of a conflict of interest because he wanted the Navy to, have his guns in all their ships. So it's a little bit of a kerfuffle there with Dahlgren in terms of how the Navy viewed this. But nonetheless, these weapons were used aboard U.S. Kearsarge and many of the Union vessels because they were just, they were just so efficient and effective. All right. Yeah, so the Kearsarge, one of the top line Union vessels built in Portsmouth Navy Yard, Kittery, Maine, under an emergency shipbuilding program. Yeah, this was an initiative that Lincoln pushed through to basically beef up the blockade. It was a Mohican class sloop of war, command 1862, commissioned in 1862 rather, under Commander Pickering. And her job was simple: hunt Confederate raiders, right? Confederate raiders, the Confederacy wanted fast, nimble vessels that could outrun the blockade, right? So Baltimore Clippers, for example, fast paddle wheelers, fast steam screw vessels, all of these types of vessels, the Confederacy were sought these out, and Kearsarge's job was really simple: hunt them down and blow them up. So she was always busy hunting Confederate raiders. So this should sound familiar for those of you that saw the War of 1812 talk, the Potomac Flotilla, flying flotilla of gunboats. Here they are again, gunboats and shallow draft vessels to protect the bay. This makes sense because the bay, as you know, is many shallow tributaries, creeks and whatnot, rivers, Patuxent being one of them. So this was a good solution to protect those tributaries and shallow waters because the big ships couldn't get in there, right? So May 16th, 1861, James Ward sets out from New York Navy Yard with 3 vessels, the Freeborn, the Reliance, and the Resolute. Ward's flotilla engaged the Confederate at Matthias Point, Virginia. Ward was killed. And there's a little illustration of his flotilla engaging the Confederates on the shore. So this was, this was a good idea. I mean, this was the first of the flotillas, but there were many Union gunboats going up and down all of the rivers. A great example of one, we'll get to that later on in the talk, is the Tulip, which blew up over at St. Inigo's, anyway, St. Mary's. Okay, so just like any tactic where you're facing a superior adversary, the blockade runners was basically a guerrilla-style warfare on the water, needed to continue imports and exports to and from the southern states. They had to get the supplies and material, the food, the weapons, etc., to basically maintain the war effort. And most were from foreign ports. The USS Commodore Barney, one of many, charged with the impossible task of blockading the Chesapeake's western shore. So yeah, I mean, here again, these larger vessels on station, flying the stars and stripes, so everyone knew what side they were on. And these shallower, faster, nimble vessels like the one on the upper right could just blow right by them. They might take a few shots, but they, by and large, would get through. So the blockade, in spite of best efforts, in spite of a lot of ships, was pretty porous, okay? This is perhaps one of the funniest. Okay, so talk about creative. The St. Nicholas incident. This is actually kind of hilarious. The plan was to use the supply steamer, capture the supply steamer, St. Nicholas, to capture the USS Pawnee, which is down in the lower right here. It's the brainchild of Richard T. Zarvona. So basically, the St. Nicholas left Baltimore June 28th, 1861, with 16 disguised recruits, passengers. And Zarvona, disguised as a flirtatious Frenchwoman, Madame LaForce, right? So Madame LaForce, in her steamer trunk that she brought aboard, had pistols and muskets and cutlasses and whatnot in her cabin. So, but what basically happened, the bandits retired to LaForce's cabin, stateroom, armed themselves and took over the ship. So unfortunately for them, the Pawnee had been recalled to DC, so their big prize wasn't there. But they did capture the Monticello, the Mary Pierce, and the Margaret. And you can see the different commodities aboard: coffee, ice, and coal. They would have preferred musket balls and gunpowder and things like that of a military nature, but at least the Union or the Confederate soldiers would have a nice cup of coffee in the morning. So anyway, this is one of the more comic, and you can see in the upper right, this was a cartoon, I think it was in Harper's, of this incident. There's Madame LaForce dressed as a woman, taking the steamboat winner in her hands, this model, which is pretty funny. So yeah, as I mentioned, smuggling on the bay. Levi White was a special agent in the Confederate States Ordnance Department, 1861. He was a very shrewd locator, purchaser, smuggler very daring, and he was a guy that could get, if you needed something, the South needed something, he was the guy you'd go to and smuggle from Baltimore and surrounds to Richmond. Yeah, he had a schooner with a false bulkhead that it looked like the aft part of the ship, like there was nothing behind it. But in fact, that's where the quotes contraband was stored. And yeah, he had a supply of whiskey. So when he was stopped at the Union blockade, he would often offer the boarding officer, the boarding party, a drink and get them kind of liquored up, and they'd be happy and they'd forget about the fault. They didn't know there was a false bulkhead, but they wouldn't be as perhaps scrupulous or as diligent as they might have been if they were sober. So he found that as a very good ally. And yeah, the Union gunboats, we could see them better than they could see us. This was classic. I mean, like I said, it was a stationary target. It was easy to spot. There's the Union blockade. How do we get around it? Okay. So yeah, Henry Holiday and his cousins, this was just one example of many of how you would work your way out of Maryland if you were a Southern sympathizer and get to points south. You know, Eastern Shore Marylander with Southern sympathies, this was planned in secret. They made their way from one sympathizer to the next, hiding wherever they needed to, including potato holes, transported down the Nanticoke River by dugout canoe. The price was $20 in gold to make this voyage. So this was kind of a circuit that you would follow on the Eastern Shore if you wanted to get to, say, Virginia or points further south. Yeah, this happened all the time. Yeah, so I mentioned this already. Basically, the upshot on this pane is basically the Confederate ships ordered fast cruisers from English shipyards, and England knew what they were up to. England maintained a position of careful neutrality between the Union and the Confederacy. They were happy for the business, but they didn't want to take sides at this point because they didn't really know the outcome. So when you don't know who's going to come out on top, neutrality is a good place a good stance to take diplomatically. Okay. And as I mentioned, the South didn't have any type of shipyard infrastructure that the North did, so they had to do this, okay? Yeah, so the CSS Alabama, that was perhaps the most famous of the South's Confederate raider, the CSS Alabama. She captured 62 Yankee merchant ships worth $6 million in cargo, appropriated cargo, 2 years before it finally sunk in 1864 by good old USS Kearsarge, the Battle of Cherbourg Roads, and that's the lower left pane. That was kind of a spectator fest for everybody who was watching it. People were on the shore. They saw this naval engagement, lasted, I think, a couple hours. I think the CSS Alabama fired something like 360 rounds, whereas the Kearsarge took her time with her big shell guns and did a lot more damage and sunk her. So anyway, prior to that, she was feared. It was a feared vessel. It was fast. It was well armed. It was well run. A good group of sailors on board. Built in Liverpool by John Laird and Sons, hull number 290 in the summer of 1862. Yeah, never docked in a southern port because she was busy raiding the whole time. She was always at sea. Okay. All right. So yeah, I mean, we've touched on this a little bit in past few slides. The workarounds, right? The Confederacy had to improvise and produce a secret weapon that could destroy the traditional Union fleet. So yeah, it's like anything else, guerrilla tactics. When you're faced with something that you can't match, you've got to come up with something else. So the sort of the tick list, they needed a vessel that could withstand naval shell gun fire, right? Very destructive guns, and they could not be burned. So what does that mean? That means maybe something, I don't know, made of metal. Also wanted a vessel that's difficult to see and hit. So it's the birth of the stealth weapon, right? So yeah, I mean, these large frigates with their towering masts and all that sail, well, that's very flammable and very easy to see from a distance. They wanted something that was not easy to see, something that was tough, something that was not dependent upon the vicissitudes of the wind. So you know what I'm talking about. Of course, we're talking about the Ironclads. I'm just dragging it out a little bit for dramatic effect. So what was what was the other stealth weapon the Confederacy developed? You all know this, I'm sure. The Hunley, right? The sub, iron-hulled submersible of 1863. Just another attempt to break the naval blockade. It basically, you can see the diagram in the middle pane on the upper middle pane there. didn't have an engine per se because they didn't know what to do with the fumes, the exhaust, right? So they had a crankshaft that ran the length of the vessel, and it was basically human powered. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 men manning this crankshaft that turned this large screw, and that was the drill. You can see the profile how narrow it was. It was like just a very small tube able to fit these men. Attacked the USS Housatonic in Charleston Harbor, February 1864, under command of Charles Dixon. Sent the Union ship to the bottom in 5 minutes, and then it sunk itself. So we're very fortunate that this wreck was uncovered. And you can see in the upper right-hand pane, the Hunley was raised and recovered semi-recently, the last 20 years or so. And so we were able to figure out kind of more about her, how she was manned, how she was used, her design, etc. So again, pretty bold move. She had a boom projecting off the front with a charge at the end of it, so that was meant to lodge into the side of the hull ship, and then they pull a trigger to blow up and blow a hole in the side of the ship. That was the quotes torpedo that they used to sink the Housatonic. So, of course, the genesis of the CSS Virginia, or the Merrimack. The Confederates raised the USS Merrimack, renamed her the CSS Virginia. Of course, yeah, vastly different ship. She had Merrimack's underwater body, and you can see on the upper right here, basically this black portion is the underwater body of the USS Merrimack. The upper part is very different. It's a casement that was built and reinforced by the Confederates, and it was ingenious. It really was. It was a groundbreaker. My goodness, I mean, necessity is the mother of invention, and this is certainly the case with the Merrimack. All right. And this is basically, in addition to the casemate and ram, she was ironclad, but not made of iron. This is important, hence the term ironclad. She's not strictly made of metal. And a large wooden casement that was built on the deck, and then the iron cladding was then spiked and bolted to it to give it basically protection from those shell guns that we mentioned. Battery consisted of 4 muzzle-loading single-banded Brooke rifles and 6 smoothbore 9-inch Dahlgren guns. So there's the Dahlgren guns. The Confederates used them too. You can see this is at the Mariners Museum. You can actually walk inside of this, which is quite wonderful because you get to go inside the Merrimack, or the Virginia rather, and see what it would have been like. You see these black tracks on the deck. Well, that's for the swivels. Those were iron hard points let into the wooden planking so that these very heavy cannons wouldn't just carve a groove in the wood, which they would otherwise. So bow and stern pivot guns, 7-inch, and weighed 14,500 pounds each, and they fired 104-pound shells. So that's large punching power that this vessel had when you consider what she was going up against, which were wooden-hulled the Union Navy, which largely was steam frigates and traditional frigates, okay? Just for those of you that are interested in structures and boat building, you can see a little bit of how she was built. These are wonderful illustrations of her hull, showing right here the original Merrimack portion from the keel, first floor, first futtock, second futtock, third futtock, and then they basically fit deck beams and the casement, which was basically mated to the hull planking, and these 3 decks that were fitted inside of that. And you can see the casement was made of oak and pine, and then the iron put over that. You can see on the upper right how that was built. So ingenious, really. So the North, when they got wind, of course they did, everybody had spies, sure. And when they got wind of what the South was up to, they panicked, fearing that the North would not have a weapon to match the South's new stealth weapon. They solicited bids for their own ironclad, okay? The design chosen was by John Ericsson. And it was nothing short of revolutionary. He was a Swiss designer. And yeah, importantly, Monitor was designed, not retrofitted. It wasn't some hulk that they raised and then converted into this thing. This was designed from the keel up to be just groundbreaking, okay? And it had several design innovations. He filed patents for all of those and got them. So birth of the modern naval vessel. Monitor had 2 principal strengths. What were they? Well, you can probably guess. That round thing on the deck there, well, that's the birth of the first modern turret. Okay, we'd see these all the way. We see them all the way to ships, serving ships today, line vessels today. So the idea again that the vessel could go in a straight trajectory and the turret could pivot to the best point of fire, shower the target with devastating broadside here. You can see this illustration of what the interior of that turret looked like. Now, of course, this was so groundbreaking, and the screw, the propeller was of a different design, and it had some bugs. Okay, it wasn't ever designed to be a sea boat, and we'll get to that in a little bit. It wasn't designed to go in the open ocean. It was designed for protected coastal waters, and that was Erickson thought everybody understood that or was aware of that. Also, the turret, where it made it the deck, it wasn't quite a great fit. It leaked, so that was a problem too. And you can see the water line for this vessel is almost at the deck. You can see right here, very little amount of hull above the water, almost like a sub, really, a surface sub. So very little to hit, okay? It would take a lot. It's almost impossible to sink, really, because the density of water would stop any very dangerous shell from really doing much damage to the underwater body of the hull, okay? And to be fair, I mean, CSS Virginia was somewhat similar, okay? So construction, yeah, keel was laid on October 25th, 1861, launched 118 days later at Greenpoint in Brooklyn, shipyard of Thomas F. Rowland. 172 feet long, beam of 41 feet, draft around 10 feet. Yeah, and as I mentioned, that unique Erickson designed propeller, you can see up here, very efficient propeller, and this is an anchor. This is on display at the Mariners Museum. That was a patented invention. The anchor was very different. And there you can see in the lower right, her launching her at Greenpoint. Crowds are cheering, everybody's having a good time, as with every launch. Yeah, and I mentioned the Mariners Museum. They have replicas of each that you can go in a wonderful exhibit display hall. And this is, I believe, the Cumberland in the background, traditional Brazos sloop of war. And then this is the casement for the CSS Virginia. There's a figure there to give you scale. And like I said, you can go inside it. And then they have a full-scale replica of the monitor, and also a federally funded monitor interpretive center where the monitor was raised, or portions of it were raised anyway. It's been ongoing past couple decades, and they have a conservation lab you can tour, and they have wonderfully replicated like how the turret looked when they found her, how she would be when she was in service. It's just a wonderful amount of material to take in with the Mariners Museum. All right. So you can see a little comparison there. Wonderful too. Again, monitor is much smaller, lower profile, not as heavily armed, but much more maneuverable, okay? And when you think about the keel length of the the Virginia, took much longer to turn than the Monitor. Monitor could pivot much more quickly. And again, just not much target above the water, all right? Yeah, so Captain John Warden was in command of U.S. Monitor, left New York on March 6, 1862. It quickly became evident Monitor was not a seagoing vessel. Monitor almost sank twice. Yeah, these seas that she shipped would leak. This smokestack aft got knocked off, I think, a couple times. The joint between the turret and the deck was leaking crazily. She was shipping a lot of water. Pumps were just barely keeping up. He barely made it down south to Hampton Roads. It was not a good trip, all right? So March 8, 1862, Virginia slid into the water. On that very day, Ironclad Virginia destroyed 2 big Union frigates. Franklin Buchanan was in command. So yeah, this was a huge game changer. This paradigm shift, as we call it. What we thought was one thing at one point, what was a frontline weapon is now completely obsolete. And it's birth of a new era. Okay, so the Corvette USS Cumberland was stove in and sunk by Virginia's ram, which broke off when she withdrew. Crew fought valiantly until the last as the ship sunk from under them. It was the end of the wooden warship as a frontline defense. And this this operates on so many levels. It's been said that none fought so gallantly as those captain, officers, and crew of the Cumberland as she went down. It was a heartbreaking moment. I mean, you think about the age of sail and all that goes with it, the tradition of hardy sailors up on, handling lines and furling sails and fighting from the tops and fighting these epic broadsides, and all very well coordinated by the officers. This is all gone. This is the rise of the engineer over the sailor, and it's pretty amazing, really. And it's been said that something went out of the Navy when it made the transition from sail to steam. There wasn't that bravado or that gusto that was required to sail, man, and fight on these sailing vessels as opposed to the ironclads and the steam propulsion. Okay, so again, a heartbreaking moment. These vessels went down pretty quick, and people were left thinking like, what is this thing? It was also very fearful from a morale standpoint to see this thing belching smoke that didn't look like anything that they were used to, coming down, bearing down on them and basically destroying them. So Congress, grounded it on fire. She raises anchor and tries to flee and runs aground. Congress suffers large casualties, surrenders. Fire from the shore compels Buchanan to re-engage using hot shot. This is a shot that's heated up so that it catches, as soon as it hits wood or canvas, catches on fire. The idea is to hit the magazine and blow it up. So Congress burns into the night, finally blowing up, and you see that blowing up on the lower right. Again, this was devastating. The Union Navy didn't know what to make of it, but they knew they had their quote secret weapon coming. She was on her way. Minnesota barely escapes, also grounded in shallow water. It was too shallow for the Virginia, fortunately, to get close enough to do any real damage. Light fading at the end of the day, Virginia withdraws, but has racked up quite a tally of Union naval vessels, okay? So when news of the battle reached Washington, people freaked out, right? The South unleashed a new super weapon, shift in naval doctrine, sinking of the Cumberland, especially heart-rending. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton said that Virginia could sink every vessel in the north. Yeah, thanks, Ed. And it could also steam up the Potomac River and destroy Washington, disperse Congress, destroy the Capitol and public buildings. So he totally freaked out and lost his, what. He shouldn't have done that. He should have maintained, like Woodrow Wilson, maybe a calmer disposition. It's going to be fine, folks. We've got something, we've got a countermeasure. It's on its way down there. Relax. But he didn't do that. Showdown Sunday. March 9th, 1862, when they met, shores of Hampton Roads were lined with people. Yeah, this is before TV, guys, so this is the best show in town, right? These two ironclads are going to basically have this, this showdown at Hampton Roads. And Monitor arrived during the night at Fort Monroe. And so what is, beginning of the day, Virginia chugs out into the roads. Monitor comes out to meet her, and there's I think that's Congress still burning there on the left. And here's everybody on the shore. Yeah, bring a picnic. Sure, it's going to be a good time. All right. So it's the showdown. Here's basically the arc of the progression of the battle. Okay, had these basically where you can follow it. It's just kind of a corkscrew pattern, hour by hour. It was it was an ironclad slugfest. Okay, lasted 4 hours. Virginia's guns were firing the whole time. Monitor was an impossible target. It was small and mobile, easily outmaneuvered the cumbersome Virginia. Yeah, Worden was blinded. In the end, it was basically a draw. Well, both sides claimed victory. Well, that should sound familiar. Every draw in the history of warfare, if there's ever a draw, both sides always claim victory. It's what you do. Yeah, and not seemingly, it was the end of the wooden warship. Although the Navy continued to build them, okay, even though this was clearly what the best act in town, the Navy would continue to build wooden warships through the end of the century, really. Anyway, but getting ahead of myself. So Virginia, end of the battle, Virginia retires the Gosport Navy Yard, put in dry dock for repairs until April 4th. Meantime, May, advancing Union troops occupied Norfolk. So Virginia, like Monitor, was not a seagoing vessel, and her 22-foot her draft precluded her from going far up the James River. She was just too deep. Tatnall ordered her destruction. Cannon were taken off the vessel, and she was blown up and burned. So rather than falling into the hands of the Union Army and Navy, all right? Cannon were transported to Drewry's Bluff. So yeah, presaged future of new ship design. Charles Adams, Minister of England, wrote, "Has been the main talk of town. Even the Parliament, the impression is that dates the commencement of new era in warfare." Yeah, so it's pretty clear to anybody who witnessed the battle. All right. So as you mentioned, I mentioned those cannons were taken to Drewry's Bluff off of Virginia. So May 15th, Monitor, Galena, Aroostook, Port Royal, and Naugatuck steam up the James River to test defenses of Richmond as part of the Peninsula Campaign. Yeah, that was the objective here is to capture, it was always the objective, to capture the Confederates' capital, which is Virginia. So attacked Fort Darling and Drewry's Bluff. They exchanged gunfire with vessels taking the brunt of the fire. Galena's 100-pound power rifle exploded. Flotilla withdrew to City Point. So it was largely an ineffective, another draw, right? Not much going on with that initiative, but they tried to work their way up and maybe make the South sweat a little bit, like we're going to basically steam all the way up the river and attack Richmond. Okay. So just a little bit, about what else is going on in the war. Battle of Antietam, Sharpsburg. Lee and Army of North Virginia invades Maryland September 17th, 1862, was repulsed by McClellan's Army of the Potomac. Lee thought he would, find a sympathetic populace in Baltimore. He did. There were Southern sympathizers in Maryland, just like the Revolutionary War with the British going south to find, British sympathizers. Same tactic here. Lee thought that if he invaded Maryland, that a large portion of Maryland would rally, get behind him, and maybe swing Maryland to his side. This is the bloodiest single-day battle in U.S. history, with 22,717 dead, wounded, or missing. It's awful. Again, this war and the World War I, the two bloodiest wars in history, really. So Monitor was supposed to join Passaic and Montauk, for joint operations against Wilmington, North Carolina, but she founders, she sinks, just like the trip down. She was towed by the USS Rhode Island, encounters building storm off Cape Hatteras, founders December 31st, 1862. So bye-bye, she's gone. If you visit the Mariners Museum, they still have, this is a very wonderful, poignant display. They have the masthead light, the red masthead light for Monitor on display in a room all by itself. And it was very especially poignant and evocative because that was the last thing you would have seen before she sank, right? So it has a tremendously evocative, emotional, visceral impact on the viewer to see this loaded artifact in this room by itself. So anyway, well done for the Mariners Museum. We don't really need to talk about this, but the 2nd Maryland Infantry served under Jeb Stuart at Gettysburg. Again, another Maryland connection. Briefly took Culp's Hill, anchored for Union's right flank, dominated Cemetery Ridge and Baltimore Pike. So again, Maryland, what happened, and this isn't really naval, but a quick little aside on that pivotal battle that broke the South's back, Gettysburg, all right? So other things in Maryland, Camp Stanton, the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1863, which changed the federal status of more than 3.5 million enslaved African Americans. As you know, eventually become the 13th Amendment. Camp Stanton at Benedict, right over here across the Benedict Bridge, the Tucson, was the home of the Maryland 7th Regiment, also home for the Maryland 19th Regiment of U.S. colored troops, December 1863. So it's an important, another important benchmark on the way of terms of equal rights and status, at least in the armed forces. Point Lookout, those of you that have visited that, was a camp for Confederate POWs from 1863 to 65. It was the Union Camp Cross, which was converted. Nearly 50,000 Confederate prisoners were billeted there. Nearly 4,000 died. Conditions were awful. I mean, these are a lot of captured Confederate soldiers from the Battle of Gettysburg were transported down to Point Lookout. And they have a nice interpretive, I visited there around Christmas time and walked through the conditions were terrible, right? They were basically shallow trenches with rag tents over them with a modest amount of blocking on either side. And this is where maybe 4 men were billeted in these horrible little, they're not even proper tents. They're squalid, awful, disease-ridden, poor nutrition, and very harsh treatment by Union. And you have to guard a lot of men, right? So you have a very small complement garrison there. So you have to be especially harsh to instill discipline and get everybody to behave. Sidney Lanier, poet, musician, academic, was a Confederate prisoner there. He survived. Okay. There's also a wonderful memorial to those that perished down there that's lovingly maintained. So it's a good trip. If you're looking for something to do on a Sunday or Saturday afternoon, go have lunch in Leonardtown and then drive down to Point Lookout and check it out. All right. So the USS Tulip, my new favorite vessel for the Union Navy. We've just acquired a model of Tulip, which I'm very pleased about for the museum's collection. It'll be on display, well, I can't say, but I'm hoping in the near future. This was a U.S. Navy gunboat assigned to the Potomac Flotilla in 1863. Interestingly, these were Chinese vessels that were appropriated by the Union Navy and converted to gunboats. We actually, part of the acquisition that we got was a photograph of Tulip's sister ship, the Fuchsia. There's no known picture of the Tulip, but there is one of the Fuchsia. So we have a very good sense, they were sister ships, of what Tulip looked like. And we have this wonderful model now, half model that of Tulip. Anyway, she developed a defect in the starboard boiler. She was coaling at St. Inigo's, coaling up, and the captain gave explicit instructions, whatever you do, don't fire up the starboard boiler. Well, the rebels started firing from, I guess, the opposite shore, taking pot shots at Tulip. The crew panicked. What do? They fire up the starboard boiler. She blows up abreast of Ragged Point, killing 47 out of 57 crew. So it was an epic disaster. This is a little, I don't know what that is, some sort of print on the upper left of her blowing up. And interestingly, the Navy has a memorial there right next to Cross Manor that they maintain and send an honor guard every year to commemorate those naval crew and officers that perished on the Tulip. They maintain this memorial and have a brief ceremony every year. It's very nice gesture. Okay, of course, no Civil War talk regarding Maryland is complete without a little bit of mention of John Wilkes Booth, who, as you know, after shooting Lincoln, made his way through Prince George's and Charles counties, the farm of Dr. Samuel Mudd. Mudd set his leg before Booth crossed the Potomac. Mudd was in prison for his trouble. And you can see Mudd's farm there it is in the upper right. You can go visit that. I think you take, 5 north. The turnoff is off that, headed up towards points north anyway. Visit Mudd's farm, and anyway, another interesting aspect of Maryland history during the Civil War. So Monitor class vessels built for the rest of the war. They had 1 or 2 turrets and varied in use and configuration, and none of these were seagoing boats. But you can see the different iterations. This is just fascinating. The different 2 turrets. There's a little bit of a casement on the aft portion here with a pilot house. So they blended aspects of good old CSS Virginia with aspects of Monitor. Different deck arrangements. There's a swivel cannon here, a partial turret here. Since the turret leaked, they tried to find a workaround, blah, blah, blah. Lots of different things. Here's a twin screw right here with that Erickson propeller, okay? Yeah, naval traditions die hard, even in spite of the Monitor and the paradigm shift and what was clear to just about everybody with eyes in their head and half a brain. Even with that, they continue to build wooden warships through the end of the 19th century. I think that's the USS Portsmouth there. There were factions in the Navy that just wouldn't let go. It's like, it's not a true naval vessel unless it's a wooden warship with a broadside and masts, okay? And you'll see this interesting carryover in the ironclads and even the battleships in the 1920s, like the Great White Fleet, et cetera, where they kept having these masts. They didn't need them, but they kept, of course, the argument was, well, they make great observation posts while she's at sea for seeing beyond as far as you could. And that was the reason they were kept largely. Even though modern navigation kind of precluded the need for that. And you can see they're getting, this USS Puritan here in 1882, a little bit of topsides. They've swept the bow up a little bit to take those breaking waves, and there's a massive turret on the front with twin guns, again, presaging the modern dreadnoughts and battleships of the 20th century, okay? There's a flying bridge and a pilot house and a big stack, davits for boats. So they're kind of working it out. It's very much a work in progress. I mean, until you have HMS Dreadnought, turn of the century, you don't really have a good sense of what a battleship per se looked like, but they were trying, okay? So I think that's it. We actually finished 10 minutes early tonight, which is great because you folks can go out and enjoy this wonderful evening that we have. Let me see if I can stop sharing. All right. So any questions or comments or observations you'd like to share? Go ahead and fire away.
Remember to unmute before you ask. Go ahead.
All right. Well, if there's no comments, questions, or whatever, thank you for joining us tonight. And join us for our last lecture, which is in 2 weeks. Jeff mentioned, believe it's on construction, design, and production of bay boats. So bug eyes, skipjacks, dugout canoes, all of that. It's fascinating. So please join us for that and have a pleasant evening.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. If there are no questions, we'll leave it at that, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks. Take care.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Bye.